Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches Poetry. In this video we're going to be taking a look at John Keats' very famous ballad, La Belle Dame sans Merci, the beautiful woman without mercy. Now John Keats was a very interesting poet. He was very famous for his work in the Romantic movement. He was one of the sort of latter Romantic poets of his time. He lived a very sad and tragic life, plagued with disease, particularly tuberculosis, TB. Pretty much his entire family died of TB and he nursed them before contracting it himself, and he died. So you do see kind of the concept of death being echoed in a lot of his poems, and this poem is certainly one of them. He also had a sort of quite a tragic love life as well, because although he fell deeply in love with his neighbour, Fanny Brawn, he was never able to fully commit to her because of his illness. So the idea of love and death being interconnected makes a great deal of sense. Now, when you're studying La Belle Dame sans Merci, you can look at it in different ways. You can look at it from the perspective of the knight who is genuinely bewitched by some sort of femme fatale, but you can also look at it through another lens and look at it more from the woman's perspective and actually what happened to her. You can look at it as a love story that ends tragically in death, which again perhaps echoes aspects of Keats's life. But as long as you can back up your ideas, you're golden. Just make sure that you are clear in your own kind of sense of argument, and don't be afraid to look at multiple interpretations. Examiners love that. Well, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so let's start by having a little look at the title, La Belle Dame sans Merci. Okay, so the first thing you'll notice is that it is French, and that is because he's actually taken it from a 15th century French courtly poem and taken inspiration from that. It actually translates more or less to the woman who's beautiful but merciless, or without pity, without mercy. So really, immediately what we're drawing upon here is some pretty negative female stereotypes. The whole kind of concept of the femme fatale, this kind of idea of this dangerous woman, this dangerous sort of seductress. We also have a pun in the title as well. It's called La Belle Dame, and if you put those two words together, you get the word beldam, B-E-L-D-A-M. So it's a homonymic pun. Now, beldam as a noun, in its sort of most easygoing definition, means old woman, but it also has huge associations with witchcraft. So through the homonymic pun, again, we're creating this very negative stereotype or character trait of the kind of frightening, seductive woman. It gives us a real kind of clue of what this poem is going to be about. Okay, so I'm going to take each of my slides is going to deal with 3 of the quatrains at a time, okay? So let's start off at the beginning. Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? So the first thing that you're going to notice there is that we've got an interjection with the O. So again, interjections normally suggest a kind of heightened emotion. And we have got a question. Oh, what can ail thee? So what troubles you? What is causing you pain? Oh, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering. So immediately we are contrasting the traditional image of the knight, which is about being strong and chivalrous. This knight is alone, isolated, and palely loitering. Now, loitering as a verb is interesting because it suggests sort of purposelessness. Oh, that's difficult to say. Whereas knights are meant to have, you know, a real sense of duty, a real sense of purpose, whereas this person seems to be purposeless and kind of just wandering. Loitering also connotes the idea of waiting as well. This is then backed up with some pathetic fallacy. The sedge has withered from the lake. So the sedge is a kind of greenery, and no birds sing. So here, with the pathetic fallacy and adverbs like palely and verbs like withered, we're starting to get some images of death and of sickness. So whatever has happened to this knight, it creates a kind of disturbed image. And so the narrator, this unknown narrator, is saying, well, what could have possibly troubled you? Now note the way that the repetition here is used, that first line. So it really enhances how disturbing his appearance is, that it needs to be asked again. And then we get a little bit more detail we've got some adjectives, haggard and woe-begone. So now we're talking about both physical and emotional turmoil. Haggard meaning he's looking old and sick, woe-begone looking so very sad. Then we get this contrasting image, this metaphor, the squirrel's granary is full and the harvest is done. Metaphor or symbolism. The point is that the narrator is saying, look, nature is in abundance. This is a good time of year, and it demonstrates how kind of sick and undone he seems in contrast. We've got further metaphors in the next quatrain. I see a lily on thy brow. Now, lily being the plant. Of course, you do get lots of different colours, but largely you probably associate lilies with white. So again, it's drawing attention to how pale the night is, and lilies as flowers are also associated with death. So a lily on thy brow, so very, very pale, with anguish moist and fever dew. So if you look at those big abstract nouns, anguish and then fever, again, you've got deep upset, you've got sickness, and this emotional and physical turmoil is like, it's saying that he's almost like sweating. He's got beads of sweat on his forehead from the stress of it. And then those images of death and decay, again, being extended here. On thy cheeks, a fading rose. So what once was rosy cheeks, again, another metaphor and another flower image, but they are withering too. So notice we've got the repetition there, withered to withereth at the bottom. So real sense being set up that this knight, who should be strong and brave and all the rest of it, is in a dreadful way, and it's echoed in his kind of the way that he looks. Now we get into the story, because we get a shift in narrative perspective, and so now the knight is going to answer those questions and explain why he's there and why he's in this bad way. And funnily enough, it starts with a lady. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, not just beautiful, full beautiful. So the adverb full there suggests that there's nothing lacking from her beauty. She's the epitome of beauty, to the point where, of course, she is a fairy's child. So in mythology, people that were considered to be incredibly beautiful, it was like, well, you must have been made by a fairy, you must have been dropped into the world. So something kind of slightly unhuman, but certainly very ethereal. And these images of beauty are backed up in this little triad that we've got here. Her hair was long, her foot was light. So again, very, very traditional, long hair, lighter foot, again, the ethereal nature. And her eyes were wild. Now, in this last part of the triad, you've got a slight break from convention, sorry, because back in the day, I'm not sure that men were particularly interested in a woman with wild eyes. And so we've got a bit of a foreshadowing here. It's a little hint of how he is going to start viewing her. But the notion of wildness in a woman's eyes, you know, we're dealing potentially with the idea of something exciting, maybe something exotic, but there is that hint of danger as well. Like, could it be madness? You know, again, thinking about the perspective that this is coming from, i.e. the knight. Okay, so now that he's met this beautiful yet wild woman, what does he do? He makes a garland for her head and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. Okay, so another little triad for us here. What's interesting is all of the gifts are circular. So a garland for her head, bracelets, circles around her wrists, and the fragrant zone, sounds a bit rude, it's a belt made of flowers, so to go around her waist. And so one way of looking at this is, as much as this is, oh yes, I'm giving her these gifts, this is about gifts of nature, you could argue that it's also about control and entrapment, because it's like, you know, putting sort of chains around her wrists. Yes, chains of flowers, but that is a way of looking at it. And then we need to start questioning his reliability, because he says, she looked at me as she did love and made sweet moan. So she looked at me as if she loved me. She looked at me as though she wanted to love me. So we're getting his perspective. We don't actually know what that look suggested. There is certainly a hint of sexual activity here. She looked at me as she did love. That could be she was looking at me as we made love. Okay, so it could be, again, different interpretation. It could be them actually taking part in sex, and then that would make sense of and made sweet moan. It could be a climax, the climax of their lovemaking. Sweet moan is an oxymoron, of course, because moans are associated with pain or discomfort or grief, but obviously it's with sweet, so that would suggest something climactic. However, if you looked at it another way, it could be that she was moaning because of distress and he is simply interpreting it as sweetness. Okay, so it's important to look at both kind of, both interpretations or different interpretations of this moment. Okay, next quatrain. Now, I wanted just to draw attention to the active voice and the agency of all of these openings. So, I met a lady, I made a garland, I set her on. So it's very much the knight is the agent of the action. It's very active. He's in control. I set her on my pacing steed. So we've got this sort of knightly imagery. The steed is his horse. So that means that he put her on his horse and he galloped her away. Okay, so again, could be very romantic, whisking her off. Could be him kidnapping her. And then nothing else saw all day long. So that's quite interesting. I set her on my pacing steed and nothing else saw all day long. So that could be the only thing he saw was her, or it could be that was the only thing she saw. So either way, you could look at it as how romantic, they've whisked off and they're only interested in each other, that's who they see. Or you could argue that it's another form of isolation and control, and that he's sort of watching her. For sidelong, she would bend and sing a fairy song. So he's sort of enjoying watching her, listening to her song. Now, this is interesting because here we get a shift in the agency of those sentences. Okay, before it was I did this. These three stanzas start with she. So she found me roots of relish sweet and honey wild and manna dew. So we've got this little triad here, all to do with food, and it's all very kind of sort of idealistic. Manna dew means food from heaven, but we're reminded again of the wildness. She's finding wild honey. Now again, two ways of interpreting that. She could be collecting him food as a sign of her love for him. She could be collecting him food to drug him. That drugging might be because she's a dreadful, evil witch woman, or it could be because she's trying to escape. Again, ambiguous, up to you for interpretation. And sure, in language strange, she said, I love thee true. Slight difficulty here. So he's sure that in her language strange. So she's talking in a different language to him, but he's fairly certain that what she said was, I love thee true. So this could be, yes, they don't need a common language. They're able to communicate because of their love, seeming love for one another in this moment. It could be a misunderstanding. It could be that she's not saying I love thee true, but that's just what he interprets, because he's sort of romanticizing the situation. It could be that he's choosing not to see it another way. It could be her deceitfulness tricking him with promises of love in her strange language. Again, up to you to interpret. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed full sore. Elfin grot is a cave, okay? So again, she's in charge in this moment, just where she took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed. So not the happiest of verbs. However, again, it could be interpreted that she's weeping and sighing because she knows that their love is going to be difficult because they're two different people. Could be that she's weeping and sighing because she's desperately unhappy because essentially she's just been kidnapped by a knight. Could be either. But he makes it better because he shut her wild, wild eyes with kisses for. So in this little bit, we've got a shift in agency once more. So you could look at this moment as a kind of battle for control here, like a battle of power. She takes him to this place, but he then takes control by shutting her wild, wild eyes with kisses for. Now we've got this repetition here of the adjective wild that obviously we've had before. But the fact that he shuts them, you could argue that this is a kind of metaphor or kind of a symbolic moment of trying to tame the wildness out of this woman, closing off this thing about her that makes her different or other or exciting or exotic, and doing it with this notion of romance, with kisses for these, you know, imagine 2 kisses on each eyelid. But there is definitely a sense here that there could be this, again, trying to control her kind of wilder or sort of more unknown impulses. And there she lulled me asleep. That verb lulled is pretty interesting because, again, it's reminding us of potentially his view of her, that she's tricking him, that she's sort of deceiving him. She creates this sort of safe place. She lulls him into sleep. And there he dreams. Ah, woe betide. So now we've got that shift in tone quite dramatically. We've got our exclamatives. We've got another interjection. We've got the reintroduction of this noun woe that we had at the beginning, woe begone. So the sadnesses are coming. So there I dreamed, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamt. So it's kind of bringing us back almost to the present, the immediacy of this dream. We've got a bit of repetition, polyptoton, which is when your repetition is with different versions of the same root word. So dreamed, dream, dreamt. So again, perhaps this repetition is emphasizing the sort of fantasy element of this moment. Again, this criticism of her, it's almost like, you know, this dream is telling him the truth, but as we know, dreams are fantasy. On the cold hillside. So we've got a shift in tone. Now we're back to the idea of the bleakness, the coldness, back to the kind of beginning of the poem. It's not the end. This is the final set of quatrains that we're going to be looking at, the last 3. So I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all. Look at the repetition of the adjective pale, again linking into his own situation. So he starts the poem pale and distraught, but notice all of these guys, kings, princes, warriors. So we've got male authority figures. So you could argue that this is a poem that is about the kind of emasculating women that take away the power of men with their kind of seductive ways. We've got this juxtaposition in the notion of the pale warrior. A warrior is known for strength, just like with the knights. And again, we've got this idea of it being very, very sickly. So this is a real warning. Beware, you know, la Belle Dame. And that is why they cry it. La Belle Dame sans merci, thee hath in thrall. Thrall means under her spell, in her power. So notice how we're back to the notion of power and control again. Continuing in the dream, I saw their starved lips in the gloam. So lips have been personified here. They've been starved, i.e. they're not getting what they want anymore. Kisses. Yeah, it's like food, that's what you associate with starvation. But in here, you could argue that they're starved because they're no longer getting sexual satisfaction from this woman. Gloam, I can't remember whether I just said this, is twilight. So again, you've got this idea of the shifting time with horrid warning gaped wide. So really sinister imagery. Again, big warning, beware this kind of woman. And then he awakes and found me here on the cold hillside. So we've got the repetition from 2 stanzas before, and again bringing us back up to the beginning of the poem. And here is the kind of not resolution, but the kind of conclusion to the question. And this is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering. Now this is interesting because we've got this cyclical structure, haven't we? We've got this repetition of the opening stanza, but there's one sort of difference, and it's this verb here, sojourn. And sojourn means to stay briefly. So you've got a couple of different interpretations for that as well. You could argue that he is sojourning because he's going to get over it. Do you know what I mean? He'll move on. That could be optimistic. Yeah, right now I'm here on this cold, like, hillside loitering, but I will get on my horse and go on, you know, and forget about it. Or you could read it in a much more melodramatic fashion, and it could be that he's only sojourning here, staying briefly, because he's going to die from grief because of being abandoned by this woman. Again, offer both interpretations. Examiners love it when you offer more than one interpretation. Show that you're considering the different options, as long as they're feasible interpretations. Okay, so we've got some absolutely cracking stuff with form here for you to think about. So the first thing to be aware of is that Keats has chosen the form of a medieval ballad. Okay, so medieval ballads are very kind of simplistic in form. The reason is because they weren't meant to be read, they were meant to be listened to. So you weren't going to get kind of huge complex ideas, and it means that your meter and your rhyme scheme is going to be very, very regular. We can certainly see this here because we've got an ABCB rhyme scheme the whole way through. So that's very kind of common for ballad form. Now, the majority of the meter is iambic tetrameter. So every stanza, the first 3 lines of that quatrain meaning 4-line stanza, is an iambic tetrameter. So beat on the 2nd syllable and 8-ish syllables in total. With an exception, and that's the 4th line. The 4th line of every stanza is an iambic dimeter, which basically means 2 feet, 4 syllables. So the last line of every stanza feels cut short, it feels abrupt, it feels without conclusion. So it's really, really symbolic of this sort of sudden break, this kind of jarring break, the abruptness of her departure, that potential link between love and death, the abrupt ending of relationships. It's really mimetic of some of the themes of the poem. And what you'll also notice is on certain lines, the 4th lines I'm talking about, where we're in iambic dimeter, sometimes the iambic meter breaks and you get little anapestic rhythms. Anapestic is when you have sort of 2 beats before the stressed. And the best one, if you wanted to talk about this is a great thing for like your flashcard that you can add to it. The best one for you to talk about it was "and her eyes were wild." Yeah, iambic dimeter would be "her eyes were wild," but instead, "and her eyes were wild." It does it again on the cold hillside. So I think really what's happening here is that you're getting an extra focus on those lines, and I think that's right, because "and her eyes were wild" I think is almost like the crux of how he perceives her, this exotic, wild temptress. And then "on the cold hillside" is the impact of it. It's the kind of bleakness, the pathetic fallacy. It symbolizes the loss he feels when he realizes that she's gone. Clever, hey? Clever John Keats with his form. Right, that's it from me. Sorry, that's quite a long video, but it's a very long poem, and I hope that you agree that it's a brilliant one. It's brilliant because of its ambiguity, because it means that you have to think things through and consider different interpretations. One of the things that I like about it is I like combining. I like looking at it from her perspective and thinking about the experience that she went through. But I also like looking at it in tandem from his, and seeing that potential misunderstanding that what he perceives as happening is this extraordinary love affair, because he is unaware that his actions, perhaps in stealing a woman away, are not okay. And then you also get you read into it and you see her side as well. I think it's an interesting way to look at it. Some people look at it as just a poem about love that cannot last and is therefore really, really devastating. I don't, but it's up to you to decide. Right, that's it from me. Thank you for sticking with me. If you found this video useful, do subscribe. That would be super duper. Otherwise, tune in for the next video in the series. Thanks again. Happy revising.